You can tell that you're at a telecoms event when you dial 0 for a wake-up call and Paul White from the award-winning NTA answers. That was a very frightening experience last night. I don't know how he did it, but he was there. Anyway, nothing bad happened, I'm very pleased to say. So it's a pleasure to be with so many friends and colleagues, and actually, virtually everybody in the room is both a friend and a colleague. As Dan has said, such great surroundings as well. And when Dan asked me to possibly entertain the concept of a keynote, I thought it's a very weighty responsibility. And the title that came up in my mind straight away was Open Source Beyond the Bottom Line. And the reason it came up is whenever you tell people you're involved with open source, or you work in open source, or use open source, once you start explaining, what's the very first question that people start to ask? How do you make money? How do you monetize around it? And I thought, well, I would like to investigate that a bit, but I would like to go beyond that and ask further questions. And so what I did was created a survey, and I sent it out to 10 open source projects. They're not the only open source projects that are out there, and actually, as you'll see when I come to the end of the presentation, the survey is still live, and I'd like people to further contribute. But this talk is really based on that research, and I will go on to explain. So I want to tell you about my plan, what the aims of this presentation were, the projects that I talked to, the questions that I asked, more importantly, the answers that came back, and the conclusions that we can draw. Now, I will draw some very limited conclusions, but I think you all will be able to draw your own conclusions. And I need to say something about this presentation. It's unlike any presentation I've ever done before, in that there are no pictures. Usually, you try and summarize things into a very whizzy picture or some hard-hitting three-word title. But actually, I'll go on to explain in a moment, I found what came back in the survey so important and so interesting, I didn't think it could be minimized. And so I'm actually conveying a lot of what I was given in the survey. And I'll go on to explain that as we go through. So let's have a look. So a bit of background. My name's David Duffet, author, speaker, trainer. Until 2019, until February of this year, I was the worldwide community director for the Asterisk project. And that has allowed me, over these years, to build up a lot of friends and contacts in the open source comms community that I'm very blessed to have. Currently, I'm working on a project, it's a book and some training, especially for geeks, to help them speak, and it's called Let the Geek Speak, because I think it's time that nerds were heard, and I want to help propeller heads propel ahead with their careers and things, but I'll be doing a talk about that later on. So what was the plan? I wanted to inquire through the connections and the contacts I've made over the years and ask them some questions with a view to passing on some insights to you. Now, when I approached the people to contribute, I told them that they would be doing so anonymously. I knew their responses, but their responses would be presented anonymously. And what that means is during this presentation, when you read some of the responses, they actually had the names of the project in, so they might have mentioned the name of their project, and I replaced that with the project. Or if they said, you know, I'm really proud because our project turned out to be the best open source PBX, that would make it obvious who it might be, and so I replaced it with the best project of this nature. So I've anonymized the answers as we go through. And this is my aim. I want to, at the beginning of this conference, a great conference where we're going to have a lot of fun, but there's a lot of very, very talented open source comms people in the room. I wanted to raise some questions that people will start talking about. Build empathy for the people that run open source projects, because we're all involved in one way or another, whether we're working in open source projects, using open source projects, or whatever. And I believe the information that I've collected so far could be used to inform the beginning of any new open source project or the optimization of an existing open source project. And in the end, I want it to help us all be better open source citizens, if you will. So here are the projects I'm very, very grateful to. All of the leaders of these projects came back and answered my questions. And the questions were quite detailed. I'm going to go through each of the questions quickly before I jump into the responses. So all of the folk from these projects contributed back. First question was, well, why did you start it? What got you going? Why did you start your open source project? Next one was because we're going to go beyond the bottom line. I've got to start at the bottom line to go beyond it. So the question was, did you have any initial strategies about how you might make money? If you did, what were they? But what proved to be the ways that you actually made money when you got going in your open source project? Then I asked, did you collect any metrics of your open source project? And if you did, what were they? I also asked, a bit of hindsight here, if you could go back in time knowing what you know now, would you still make your project open source? And regardless of your answer to that question, what would you do differently next time around? So you can see most of these questions are not yes or no answers. There's a few yes or no answers, but most of them, are really allowing people to generate whatever they want in coming back. Then I asked, under my heading Blessings and Curses, what's the best thing about open source? What's the worst thing about open source? And a very poignant question, because it was actually embedded in some of the things that Dan said earlier. There are people that use open source projects who are immensely successful but never contribute back to those projects. So I asked the question, what do you think about people and companies that do that just take and never give back? Then I asked people to take a little step back, maybe have a sit down and a cup of coffee, and say, what are you proudest of about your open source project, and what are you most grateful for in your open source project? What were the bumps along the road in your open source project? What kind of advice would you give people that were starting out? And lastly, what are your thoughts on the future of open source? So those are the questions that I went out there with. And actually the responses, first of all, left me very humbled that the leaders of these projects would actually take the time to complete. It's not a 5-question yes or no questionnaire. It went on a long time. And so I'm very, very grateful to everybody that contributed back. Not only for doing it, but, and you're going to see this in the replies when they come up, the openness and the honesty that's so evident in these replies. And lastly, it left me, and I hope it's going to leave you, inspired by the generosity of spirit, the faith in humanity, the depth of thought, but also the profundity of some of the things that were said. Some of these things are very deeply profound, and I think you'll find that when we look at the answers. So, thinking of the answers, I've not put every single answer that I got in, but a lot of them are here. This is a very, very text-heavy presentation, and part of that is because once I'd kind of unlocked this and got these answers back, I felt a real weight of responsibility. I didn't feel that this text could actually be summarised by pictures and zappy PowerPoint stuff. I felt I'd got to convey it to you all. I felt a burden of responsibility. But in some cases, I have done a little bit of summarising. I'm going to highlight things that I think are interesting angles. Also, when there's a consensus that comes up amongst the people that responded, and also a few personal favourite responses that came back as well. The other reason for leaving all the text in is that this slide set is really a document, and everybody's going to be able to get hold of a document, and so you'll be able to read the responses. So, as the responses come up on the screen, I'm not necessarily going to leave you to read all of them. I will pick out certain bits, but when you get the slides afterwards, you will be able to read things in their entirety. How does that sound? Does that sound all right? Good. Okay, so let's jump onto those answers. Why did you start your open source project? I really liked the first one. I had more problems and ideas, and I did existing solutions for them. I thought that was a good place to start. Some of you have probably heard this one as well. Thought it would be a good way of saving money, a cost-saving measure. But my personal favourite response was, it seemed like the most convenient way to build up and eventually demonstrate work experience without the need to go through tedious internships. Thought that was a great one that came back. Somebody that had got an end in mind and was able to achieve that with open source. So there were a few different responses that came back about why people started them in the first place. But you could summarise it that they either thought that technology was missing or they thought there was a better or cheaper way to do things. So what ideas did you have, did you have any ideas about strategies to make money from your open source project? Interesting answer. Out of the 10 projects I consulted with, it was a straight split, 50-50. Some people did, and some people didn't. And so for the ones that did think about how they might make money, what came up? Well, of course, one of the obvious answers that always comes up around this is consultancy, doing things around the project. Whether that's implementing the project in a kind of done-for-you sense for people that don't want to get their hands dirty and do it, whether it's actually expanding the functionality of a given open source project to build things in that a customer with vested interest didn't have already, those kind of things. But here's an interesting response that I didn't expect to see, because it wasn't necessarily under the heading of money. But look, it said we did pick the dependencies that very carefully, since the beginning, choosing ones with relatively permissive licenses that wouldn't have an impact on ours. And you'll find as we go through that licensing crops up quite a lot in the subject that we're talking about. Other people said, well, by selling knowledge and services around the product, somebody quoted the Red Hat model, put the product out there and build services around them. Dual licensing was one that came up. That's where you, as the owner of a software, retain the ability to sell a non-open source version to those people that don't want to be bound by whichever open source license you've chosen to use. Here's an interesting one at the bottom. Many years later, working for the new owners. That was a guy that had worked on a project many years ago. Won't name the project here and now. He'd worked on it very many years ago. And then others of his responses come back a little bit later. What he'd found is he wasn't making any money in this project, and he needed to make some money, so he went and took a job, and he handed the project to somebody else. It grew over some years, and then he came back to it later and worked for the new employer. Interesting one. Okay, hardware products. You can probably guess which project that was around, but I would suggest that the opportunities around hardware products are probably decreasing a little bit. And here's an observation of mine on this. It didn't come up, but one of the strategies I've actually seen employed, whether it was deliberate or not, was studying the commercial ecosystem that builds up around your project, and then acquiring some of those projects, if you've got the financial muscle to do it, either to buy in the technical excellence from that project or to take advantage of the commercial success that the other people have had. So that's something that we have seen come about. Moving on to metrics. I asked, did you collect or do you collect any metrics about your open source project? Surprisingly, only 60% of people said yes. And I think this is, quite an important area, collecting metrics so you know what's going on. What do those that measure? Well, lines of code is one measurement. GitHub and repo stats came back. Number of downloads in a given day, month, year, whatever period. Mailing list activity or forum activity. Module use, particular modules. And one project in particular had full-blown usage stats so they could properly track engagement. And I'll come back to that when we do some conclusions about the metrics. With hindsight, if you could go back in time, would you still make your project open source? What do you think people said there? They jolly well did. 100% of the people came back and said, yes, I would still go open source. And so it was a genuine no regrets phase, and I could hear all the powerful music playing in the background when I uncovered that. So regardless, I said, what would you do differently next time around? And there were some very, very varied responses. Very varied responses from, I can't think of, I'd do anything differently. So that's great, isn't it? That's somebody that's had a really positive experience throughout the life cycle of their open source project. They wouldn't necessarily do anything different. Better aligning monetization and development strategies. Expand the team sooner. There's a bit of a financial imperative on that one. It's one of those benefits of hindsight things. What else did we have? Now, this is 3 separate responses, and the reason I've highlighted them in blue is just to pick up on the fact that they're all about licensing somewhere or other. So that first one, we'd probably better clarify the licensing aspects, including the CLA. CLA means Contributor Licensing Agreement. So when people contribute to a project, how are they doing that? Choose a suitable license for each component, and might examine some of the newer license models. So I think it's very telling that a lot of people in open source, and there were other ones around this as well, but a lot of them, if they could have their time again, would do a bit more, perhaps, due diligence on the kind of licensing model that they would use and the mechanisms that they might employ. Other answers, pay more attention to the community, probably at an earlier stage, and try and get it very involved. Here's an interesting one. I wouldn't have done consulting. So, of course, that's one of the very apparent money-making models that comes up around open source, and yet one of the responses was, I wouldn't have done that. I'd have changed things and done them differently. And then coordinate the business ecosystem a bit better, maybe being a bit more proactive in the rise of the ecosystem around the project. Well, blessings and curses. There are both in abundance in the world of open source. And I said, what is the best thing about being open source? What answer do you think came back there? Users. Community. Of course it did. Then I said, what's the worst thing? What answer do you think came back? we could have guessed that. Those were not the only answers, but that was a genuine response from one participant. He answered the community to both. And actually, interestingly, across all of the questions, on some I got a one-word answer, and in the same question that one person gave a one-word answer, somebody else gave like a 200-word answer to. So there's a very great range of things that came back. But just stepping aside from the community, looking at some of the other things that were said, the product being known and used by a large number of people, but, taking pride in the fact that it's out there. Community involvement, the potential for a dedicated community, and getting people to use your product and getting your name and your product known out there. Here was one of the more wordy responses. We're not going to read it all, but definitely the community coming up as the best thing, and you can read that explanation in full a little bit later on. But there's great stuff there. In fact, the gentleman that replied here went on to talk about getting involved in FOSDEM and all some of the other things, and that opening a new world of community relations and more open source stuff. What else have we got? More community. Here's an interesting one. You never lose your work as you change employers, because it's an open source project, which is a very nice one. It's always yours to show and reuse. Significantly easier to talk about your work when it's open source, because there's not some of those commercial restrictions around it. Never need to worry about keeping your work secret. And one of the ones here was lower adoption friction, which I happen to have duplicated here. But I wanted to point to this one here. We know that security is a very, very important thing on people's agendas these days. Transparency on security, that's one of the best things about open source. Because as it says here, if anyone has doubts as to what happens to their data, they can always go in and check exactly what's going on, because they can see everything in the source code. Some people thought very deeply about this and said the following two are waved around as the major advantages, but actually, he said, I don't think they are the main ones, even though they are still worth talking about. And that was the testing and the things you get from the community and so on. So lots of different responses that came back, the community definitely being very, very prominent amongst them. So then we moved on to what are the worst things about your project being open source? Well, of course, there's those individual troublesome times when people jump on the internet and think that you should be doing everything for free. However, what about this one? People using your project to build a business and compete with you. And we've probably seen that unfold on more than one occasion in the open source community, or the open source world, I should say. People using open source software expecting their bugs and requests to be treated as if they're paying you, without the paying bit going on. We've probably all come across that one as well. Now, this was a very interesting one to me. You might get some contributions, but you also get a lot of noise. And I know from personal experience that looking at the quality of code of contributions and the way contributions are done, that actually takes up a lot of bandwidth within a project. And so, some of the things that we think are great, those community contributions, they are great, but they come with work attached. The marshalling of bugs and all of those kinds of things as well. There's a nasty one. Ruthless, ungrateful expectations for continued service and evolution. It's not very nice, is it? It can be a little bit of a thankless task out there in the world of open source. And this one, I don't like to use bad language in presentations, so I've had to edit that slightly. But the attitude that you gave me this thing, and now you've got to go and make it do whatever I want it to, whatever I need it to, otherwise you're useless. Not very, very nice. So there are some bad things around. Then I asked, what are your thoughts about those people or companies that have been successful effectively on the back of your projects and not given back. Because, of course, there are companies that we recognise around the world that do well out of open source and actively want to give back. You know, they make it part of their mission. You may remember, just to use a name here quickly, Jared Smith. Jared Smith was actively involved in the Asterisk project, but one of the other jobs he went on to do was to be the open source guy in a rather large company, and he was responsible for going to help other open source projects that company used. So there are some companies that actively do that. Let's have a look at some of the things that came back. Well, somebody said, well, we've got a dual licensing model, so it kind of prevents some of that from going on. Bit of a pragmatic, well, it's the nature of the beast. You know, if you do put it out there, what do you expect is going to happen? Somebody's feeling very positive. And by the way, one thing I would like to say is there are no right or wrong answers here, are they? There might be answers that resonate more with the way you think, or more with the way you think, or more with the way I think, but there are no right and wrong answers. These are people's individual opinions, and they're all just as valid as each other. So there's the, I'm very excited and proud to have made it possible. No real concerns about it. Ignore them, otherwise it could be a waste of time. Then I got this. That was a really big answer. And this is one of the ones that really touched me because it's so honest. So honest. When I really think about it, it enrages me. Because we've seen it, haven't we? We've seen people create, the project that I was very involved with. I always thought, felt a bit sorry in a way that the person that started that project didn't do better. I mean, I know they did well, but I've always thought they could do a lot better, or should have done a lot better, because people run off and use it. And so I could identify with that a little bit. You'll be able to read that separately. But, I thought it was interesting that you get, it's the nature of the beast. And then you get, a deep response like that as well. Very, very interesting. Another one, love them all. It's the name of the game. And there's one at the bottom. Never forget, you made that choice in the first place. You told people to take your stuff for free. It's schizophrenic to suddenly start sulking because people took you up on it. So you can see it's very contrasting opinions that came back. But as I said, they're all equally valid. And software, if you've helped create it, it's like your baby, isn't it? When you see people using your baby in different ways. Yeah, anyway, I won't push that analogy too far. Yes. Here's one response that came back. Funny you should mention it. I know one of the largest companies in the world uses my product. And I've heard the developers say, we'd love to contribute back, but my company makes it very difficult. Yeah. It's not very helpful, is it? Not very helpful for people who have created that project in the first place. But, just as I was saying earlier on, some people actively try and give back. There's a name mentioned there who are a sponsor of this very conference, Simwood. Simwood are one of those companies that take a lot of advantage of open source software, but actively try to give back. And so they got a mention in there. Okay, that's enough about blessings and curses. Let's sit right back and take a moment to think about what people are proudest of with their open source projects. And here's one that came back. It is the best project of its nature out there. So whatever that project was setting out to achieve, it's considered top of the tree in that domain. So that must obviously be very, very, what's the word I'm looking for? A very beautiful thing to consider, that you've created something that's risen to that position. Here's an interesting one, and it's a very altruistic one. Creating a cottage industry of people that are able to create new and innovative telecommunication products. In other words, an open source project that gave rise to a lot of other things. So there's a high degree of altruism in there. How globally recognized a particular project has become, the passion of the individuals that are involved in doing it, and, numbers here. 2 million active installs of a particular project out there. So these are all things to be very, very proud of. What other answers did we get back? Well, another altruistic one. Helps many other people to make a living. We're probably all, in some way, beneficiaries of one open source project or another. The scale of its use and its value to the companies and people that's using it. My team. That's a nice one, isn't it? My team. Every single one of them, so proud. And here's an interesting one. And actually, that same person that said it enrages me also came back and said, might be a bit bipolar, but actually I'm hugely proud of the big companies that are using it that might not be giving the money back, but it's used every day by millions of people. So, this was hitting my heart as I was reading some of this and assembling the material together. All the team comes up again, all the contributors, community contributors and employees, and the developer community is a big one that gets mentioned when we ask the question, what are you most grateful for? So we've moved from what are you most proud of to what are you most grateful for? All the contributions being included in other open source projects. That's an interesting one, isn't it? You've created your own open source project, but it's been used as a component in somebody else's open source project, and that is something to be very grateful for as well. There's another one, a more wordy one, being able to help people and also get support from employer, because there are some people that have started open source projects and work inside the framework of an employer who allows them to continue on the open source project. Maybe the open source project is a key component in something that the employer does. Or maybe, I've seen this as well, maybe the employer altruistically pays their employee and lets them do 2 days a week on something that's not even connected with it. I've seen that kind of arrangement. Okay, so moving on to the bumps in the road. What bumps were there in the road of your open source project? This one stood out to me, figuring out the monetization, proper tooling, avoiding burning out people, because there's a lot of midnight oil burnt in the early days of an open source project, and it was how to avoid those people getting totally burnt out in the process, interestingly, of managing contributions. So it wasn't necessarily the code they were writing, it was some of the work around managing the contributions of other people. This was the guy that had to hand over his project to somebody else back in the very early days. And the project that we're talking about is a top-name project that you would instantly recognise. But in the life cycle of it, he had to hand it over to somebody. He actually named the person. So I replaced it with someone else, just so I could keep things anonymous. Forks and trolls there. Finding time to spend in the early days when every hour spent on it was a non-billable event with significant opportunity cost. People take personal sacrifices or make personal sacrifices to get these things going. Slightly more long-form answer, 2 kinds of bumps. First one about trying to keep the project afloat. Second one is the struggle to find and allocate resources for it. So some common threads here when people are getting going. Bump in the road around the contribution licensing agreement. Again, you can read that one in its fullness. And then finding time, again, another theme. And here's an interesting response. Counter to a lot of the other response, it's not so much the bumps in the road, it's being able to navigate, it's the drive being able to navigate around those bumps in the road. So as you can see, there's a very wide variation of responses, and I was very, very grateful for them in the full breadth of them and the honesty of them all. And I hope you're finding these things instructional here. So, moving on to best advice. So if you could talk to some, as an elder statesman of open source, if you could talk to some young Turk that wants to start a project, what advice would you give? First one that came back was do it as a hobby or a business, but don't go half and half. Decide what it's got to be in the first instance. Select a project that's very personal to you and focus. Here's an interesting one. I'll come to this in the conclusions part. Are you ready to build a community? Because it's tougher to do that than it is to write the code. I think a few people have probably been caught with that one over the years. Don't wait for anybody's approval. Of course, in the free and open source world, you can get out there and get going. Only do it if you love it. I think that's a sort of a motto in life, really, isn't it? Only do it if you love it. You'll get burnt out, and you need to be able to look back and go, I really enjoy it, and I want to go back to it. So, those in those low moments. What other advice would there be? If the plan is to monetize, make sure you pick the right licensing popping up again. so you can retain control of the project. Apart from that, don't overthink it. If it's useful, people will engage you, and it'll be a great ride. Be sure it's more than a hobby, coming back to the hobby versus business. Here's an interesting one. Your contributors are your greatest asset. They owe you nothing. You owe them everything. Treat them right. And of course, that treating them right can go right down to the way you accept contributions, the way you deal with the contributions, the way you publicly thank contributors, the way you attribute to contributors in the headers of your source code. All of those kind of different things are encapsulated in there. Think through the business models, but don't do it unless you have a love for what you do, because that will be the main return, is getting something done that you love. So that was really the kind of information that came back from these people. And as you can see, they kind of bared their souls in answering these questions. And I had one last question, two last questions for them, actually. One of them was, in fact, no, we're at the last question. This was all about the future of open source. That was the last pointed question. And then, like any good questioner, I gave them the ability to say anything else they wanted to say. And we'll do those before we do the conclusions. But it says, what are your thoughts on the future of open source? Well, got a few different responses. It's the long-term best development model for any projects with a sufficiently wide audience who don't have technical objections. Because, of course, you need that in order to form the community, don't you, of contributors. If people are pulling in lots of different directions, well, that could be counterproductive. On the other hand, it could actually expand your open source project into places that you didn't think it was going to go. So, there's sort of a double-sided situation there. Open source is here to stay, but may see fluctuations due to SaaS players' abuse. I didn't have time to go back and find out what that meant, but I'm sure the person that wrote it had something behind there. Microsoft was quoted a couple of times when people were talking about the future of open source, just really to say that there's companies of very great weight, Microsoft, Oracle, that have embraced open source after kind of struggling against it over a number of years. What are your thoughts about the future of open source? Continuing those answers. Open source. I thought this one was an interesting one as well. The open source is still struggling to find, look at the word, survival model. So surviving as open source. I thought that was a very interesting response. And I think that is, although we know of some very, very successful open source projects, I think that is, known to a lot of open source people that they're actually trying to survive before they get into that phase of thriving and growing. It's by no means a mandatory requirement for your success. Live and let live. There are other people that do other models around there. Open source is finally emerging as a real business model. And then this one. We need to create more of a community in order to sustain the ecosystem. Business models are economic solutions to the underlying free rider problem, but what is a more promising approach to me are social solutions that involve creating community that encompasses those who make open source as well as those who use and deploy it, and which infers a set of informative behaviour on all that leads to a strengthened ecosystem. So there's some deep thought gone into some of the responses. Open source is the future, but making money out of open source can be hard. We've probably seen that around us. You need recurring revenue. I thought this was an interesting one. Obviously, we all recognise that these days it's no good selling just one thing to somebody that walks away and you never see them again. We want to try and find a recurring model. But I particularly like that phrase, microtransactions. Lots of little no-brainer transactions that people don't mind paying small amounts of money for things that are going to do them good. But across a collective, comes to an amount of money that is enough to sustain the ongoing growth of an open source project. Now, yes, here's something else I want to read fully because it uses the word sacred. It's an interesting word to come up in a discussion of open source stuff. I like to think of open source software as sacred. Open source software is unique and very different than commercial software in this one way. It asks nothing from you and seeks nothing other than to be of greatest use. This is quite different from commercial software, which, yes, while it seeks to be of use, is essentially paraded out as a means to an end, that being the profit motive. Open source software seeks only ever to be put to best use, full stop, or for you Americans, period. It's profound, isn't it? You know, to have a response like that come back to a survey, I thought was a very deep thing. And I would like you to hold that word in your mind a moment, sacred, because we're going to come back to it right at the end. So what conclusions do we draw? I think these conclusions are pretty obvious, and they're things that have just jumped up out of the pages of this presentation. You've got to consider money at the very outset. That doesn't necessarily mean you've got to consider making money, because maybe your employer is funding this project and they don't want to make money out of it, but you've got to consider the money aspect at least at the very outset. Here's one I didn't think came up enough, actually. Metrics matter. If you're going to demonstrate to potential investors, potential users, potential buyers, whatever, the weight of your open source project, you need to have metrics about how well it's used, who's using it, what they're using it for, the average number of users on a particular system, or whatever it is. So metrics are very, very important. Very important, I believe. As is, of course, the licensing model. And this is probably the thing that came up heaviest across the whole piece, was consideration of licensing. And not just the open source license that you choose to use, but the contributor license agreement as well. Very, very important. And, of course, community is key. Everybody talked about community. Yes, it was a blessing and a curse, but everybody mentioned it and the value of building that community earlier in the project. And so this gave rise to a couple of thoughts. Given the multi-dimensional nature of any open source project, are the software engineers that create the software, the code, necessarily the right people to orchestrate, maintain, and promote the other elements of the project? And then what was in my mind here is this golden rule that you've probably come across in one way or another, and that is, if you give engineers a job to do other than engineering, it's always a train wreck, isn't it? I think we all know this is true. Things go terribly wrong, and you can actually magnify that by an order of magnitude if they're software engineers. I know, from that little pleasant ripple, I know that you agree with me. And I've seen this. I'll just give you a little example of this. Some years ago, I was involved in a thing. It was actually at Astricon, and we wanted to give away some phones. And so it involved a couple of software engineers to talk about some of the software that's in the phones. And then one of the marketing people said, yeah, but we need a way of giving away the phones as prizes to some of the lucky people in the audience. How are we going to do that? So then, of course, because there were some engineers involved, it started quite a long conversation about how we might do that. And, were we going to use random numbers or would it be pseudo-random? And, there's all sorts of things that came into it. And it was a bit hideous. That's what I'm trying to say. So, I would say that enlightened software engineers, and this is a difficulty because when people have a great idea, there's probably 2 or 3 software engineering buddies who have this great idea, and they run off and they don't necessarily think to consult with other people. But I believe if they did go to people outside of their sphere to think about things like monetization angles, to think about things like community building, then I believe they would be a lot better for it. These are just a couple of short conclusions, and I know that you can draw a lot of your own conclusions as well. And as I said, all of these slides will be fully available so you can read the detailed responses. That's really the end of it in terms of what came out from the people. I want to give them massive thanks. These are the individual people that contributed back and the 10 projects that came along. I thought 10 was a very good number because it was manageable and it allowed me to look at all the text. If I'd have had 100, that would have been a very, very difficult job to do. Very, very grateful to these people. Do you remember I asked you to hold the word sacred in your minds? I want to come back to that in closing and read this out. It says, when we make something sacred, we are really just creating a trigger for our own best behaviour. In the same way, I would like to see the open source telecom community form over a respect and reverence for open source software with the understanding of the obligations that it confers on us all, both makers and users. Those of us who make open source need to understand that our code is nothing but dry words on a page until someone comes along and breathes life into them by deploying that code. And those who use open source need to understand that they are participating in an ecosystem by their actions, and by their actions are always either destroying or regenerating it. There are hundreds of ways to help the ecosystem grow. Unfortunately, it's often presented to users as only one way: pay me something for my software. We need to be more thoughtful about how to sustain the ecosystem, and I believe a set of self-reinforcing norms governing community behaviour is required for virtuous success. It's pretty deep stuff, isn't it? Very thought-provoking. I think an ideal thing to close this presentation with at the beginning of this conference. And I hope it sets a lot of questions in your mind. I hope it starts a lot of conversations, because maybe we can actually talk together about better ways of doing open source. The survey is still live. You can go and find it by bit.ly, Duffet OSS survey, and I welcome further contributions. So if you founded an open source project, or you're very senior in an open source project and you would like to contribute, then please do, because it's a live thing as far as I'm concerned. I'm always looking for more information. You can find me on LinkedIn or Twitter, and with that I'd like to say it's been a pleasure telling you about this research I did. It's a pleasure conveying the thoughtfulness and the honesty of the people that responded, and I know it's going to be a pleasure for you over the next 3 days as you mull these things over in your mind. Thank you very much.
So, David, thanks for a great talk. Could you just roll back to that last slide?
I certainly could.
So in the final comment, you talk about self-reinforcing norms governing community behaviour.
Well, one of the respondents talked about that.
Yes. And there are different people running around the free software community today offering different opinions on this. Some people, I mean, a lot of them are talking about running out around tasering people, suspending people, demoting people, removing people from mailing lists. We don't see a lot of leadership skill building going on. Is that a gap that you could see, and can you see ways that the community can build leadership skills instead of simply trying to play this whack-a-mole type game?
Yeah, I think that's fundamentally part of the problem, that as an open source project, usually started by software engineers, and why wouldn't it be, that they don't look onto the soft skill side, and leadership is just one of the outworkings of that, I think. That's a very short answer to quite a long question, but I hope
Thanks.
Okay. Randy looks as if he had something.
Two questions, one quick yes or no and another longer one. First question, excellent presentation. Is this your next book?
No, this is not my next book.
Well, Dad, it should be. My question, David, to you is that you've been in the game for a couple of years, and I wonder what changes you've seen, because we're looking at people, you ask these people these questions now, but you started X number of years ago. What was it like then? And have you seen an evolution? What do you think about how things have gone over time?
Goodness, that's a deep question, Randy. I think the thing that seems to have evolved is that golden rule, and that is the person with the gold makes the rules. And I say that sort of half flippantly, but I'm talking about the recent acquisitions of various projects that you'll know about. And I guess what perhaps saddens me a bit, maybe not surprises me, but what saddens me is that people that play a very, very hard commercial game end up being in a position to take advantage of other players that maybe played a more moralistic game. More than that, I can't say. Yeah, indeed. Got Steve on the go there.
Well, when Randy said something about, you said those who've got the gold make the rules, and it suddenly dawned on me that for my country, South Africa, we're trying to find a new future that can include all, but we're basically helpless puppets of a whole global economic system that says those who've got the gold make the rules. So not sure what the question is, except, maybe some of this is just answers which is about what life is like, and it reflects the personalities and how people see things. And maybe it is just a microcosm of what you see in other areas of life as well.
I think that's true, but I do think that we have an opportunity as a collective to maybe talk about this more and come up with things that can either improve the lot generally of open source, or at least inform those that are making new projects. Because I think if people did that with the benefit of hindsight rather than operating in little silos, in particular, I just want to draw attention to Lorenzo. Lorenzo's got VoIP on the beach going on in, is it Napoli or Naples, Lorenzo?
Whatever you like.
Okay, in Napoli or Naples, either way, it's Italy. And part of that is actually about having a collective conversation about things, whether those are working practices or open source type subjects. And so people are beginning to address these things, and I think we do have an opportunity. But I agree that it's a reflection of a wider world.
And that's in September, so
September
you
the
should absolutely
23rd,
go buy your
24th,
tickets today.
25th. Is that correct? 23rd, 25th, yes, indeed.
Wonderful presentation. I distinctly remember, so I went through software engineering in the 80s, and I remember being forced to take business classes, and I remember how painful it was for a software engineer to take these business classes. I would love to see a textbook or a module that prepares software engineers of this current class to understand the issues that they face when they come out. And if there's any way you could craft this into a paper or an article, I think it would be a tremendous asset for the new software development community as they come out of college. So again, my applause to all your work here and what you've done with it.
It's definitely needed. I'm not sure whether I'm the right person to do it. Where I do think I can contribute is on the Let the Geek Speak. So just like they should have a module for business development, I think they should have a module for interfacing with people that aren't engineers. But yes, I totally agree with the need. And maybe this research could be used. Yes. Yes, sir.
I think it's sort of implied here, but one of the things, and having done a small open source project that I kind of had to just let run away from me, but the thing that probably we all as software engineers, and most open source projects are staffed by software engineers, whereas most more commercial products that are lacking is product management. And actually there's a huge, I think we forget that it's not just the software, that you still, ultimately there is a product there, and that you have to, and there's a thing I found actually doing the open source project was, suddenly I'm now product managing, I'm getting contributions, but I'm having to make product feature decisions. Is this something I want in the product? And software engineers aren't necessarily always the best placed people to be the product manager, but we very rarely talk about open source product management. And is that maybe the skill that is really lacking?
I think it's part of what Alan was saying as well. And I think part of the issue is somehow, and I don't know exactly how you can do it, but is the education of very young engineers to be more accepting. Because what tends to happen, I saw this in my own career, and maybe you've seen it in yours, is that a certain part of your career, when you're a bit younger, it's about how technical you are. You know, it's, well, that guy's not quite as technical as that guy. And, you know, and anything outside of that, you know, whether you know your onions in whatever technical domain, is not considered valid. And if we could encourage people to understand that, you know, other sections are valuable, and this is something that we all come to understand later, isn't it? We come to understand that sales is important, marketing, you know, that every company should have a marketroid in there somewhere. You know, you come to understand those things, but if we could understand it earlier, we might be a bit more successful in our projects, I think.
We see lots of companies doing startup accelerators, encouraging entrepreneurs and software engineers to go in and start building new companies and how to get funding. It would be really good if we could have something similar, either in a physical space or a virtual online toolkit to help people build and develop open source projects.
Great idea, and this is actually one of the things that the incubators do very well, isn't it? They educate and they bring along resources to do some of those soft skill things that the people that created the technical project in the first place wouldn't have been able to do otherwise. But yes, agreed. if we could make things easier for people to get hold of as well, that would be a plus.
If that's it, that was fantastic, David. I know keynotes don't usually have questions afterwards, do they?
Indeed, and keynotes do usually have whizzy pictures.
But ComCon is different in every single way, so
That's right.
thank you very much.
Thank you. And can we just keep the applause going for each of those 10 contributors, please? Because they're the people that made it.